Welcome back. In this video, we'll be talking about what a text is in the context of literary analysis, and we'll be figuring out how that plays into the purpose of literary analysis and how it can help us understand what it is we're actually doing when we analyze a piece of literature. So we established previously that literary analysis refers to the breakdown of a literary text. And by literary text, we typically mean just a piece of literature, such as a novel, a short story, poem, play, or even a memoir, which would be considered nonfiction, but is nonetheless literature. So we can think of that as creative nonfiction. And so again, we have novels, short story, poem, etc. Analysis, again, is the breaking down of something. Doesn't really matter what it is. So analytical is broader, simply literature. But in this case, and specifically in the case of literary analysis, we're thinking of the breakdown of a literary text. If we have a visual analysis, for example, we would be breaking down a visual text. And then we can use analysis to help us in other dimensions as well as in other disciplines. So it doesn't specifically belong to the realm of literature. It's a skill that we use in general. And again, analysis is this breakdown or this disassembly of something into its constituent / component parts to figure out how they work. So in the previous video, we used a tree for an example. To analyze the tree, I would want to break down the function of its various parts, these being, for example, canopy, trunk, and roots. And then by identifying and observing these three things, I learn about them and I can learn about why the tree functions as it does as a whole. While we're talking about analysis, it's worth mentioning a distinction between the skill known as summary and analysis. So to summarize something is basically to restate what it is saying on the surface. And analysis is to look at what's under the surface. This would be the subtext. We'll talk about this more in a future video. But just to clarify, summary is opposed to analysis. These are different skills. This is restatement. And it has more to do with comprehension. Analysis is more rigorous. This has to do with discovery and discernment. And this has more to do with critical thinking than comprehension. So if you were ever to be asked to summarize a story, you would basically retell the major parts of the story. You would describe the major characters, the protagonist, the antagonist. You would talk about the main conflict. You would also talk about some of the major events in the plot that constitute the exposition, the rising action, the climax, and so on. Whereas with analysis, you are asking yourself why the writer constructed the story in the way that he or she did. So you are wondering about why the characters behave the way they are, why they're characterized the way they are, why the story is set in the time and place that it's set in, and so on and so forth. So analysis is about asking why to all of the surface level components that summary would busy itself with restating. So these are two distinct skills. Students in ELA classes tend to confuse the two. They will usually summarize because summary is easier to digest and wrap one's head around, whereas analysis is a slightly more sophisticated skill that takes some practice and getting used to. So it's typical that students who have little experience with analyzing tend to get confused between the two skills and they summarize more than they analyze. Now, with that said, let's describe some terms. And in this video, we'll be talking about what we mean by text. So in an academic sense, a text basically refers to anything that can be broken down or analyzed. Even more specifically, we can think of it as something that can be read or understood. If this seems slightly vague or nebulous, in some respects it is. Essentially, a text can be anything. Everything that is observable to some degree can be analyzed, can be broken down and disassembled. And so therefore text in the academic sense has a much more general and broad definition than what we mean by text in kind of our colloquial use. We typically refer to a text as like a text message or an email, something that is written and therefore needs to be read using our comprehension abilities. But text can also refer to visual text. These are things that we see and we don't necessarily read them in a linguistic sense. We observe them using our sense of sight, and then we use particular unique visual components and attributes in order to analyze. Music, right, through the sense of hearing, can also be seen as a text. Text can be people themselves. We are all sort of composites made up of different parts, and so therefore we can all be read, quote unquote, interpreted, quote unquote, and broken down in a similar way. So when we refer to text, we're referring to anything that can be, quote unquote, read. Now, in the case of literary analysis, texts are more restricted. In ELA, literature, again, refers to things like novels, short stories, poetry, poems, etc. So a literary text constitutes any one of these things. Again, novels, short stories, poems, plays, and also memoirs, which are examples of narrative / personal writing, and other forms of creative nonfiction. And so again, the goal behind analysis is to take the surface of these various texts and break them down in order to understand why and how the author created them. So although we may be looking at things like character, setting, and so on in these various literary texts, we are also looking at things like figurative language, style, diction, and tone and mood. Style can be thought of as the way in which the text is written, the type of structure used, etc. Figurative language refers to the use of imagery and descriptive details, how ideas and otherwise abstract concepts are articulated and made more concrete within the literary text. Diction refers to use of words, how an author uses language, the type of words he or she uses, the type of connotation and denotation he or she uses. And tone and mood refers to the attitude of the author, the overall overarching attitude that the author has towards the text, versus mood, which is the expected response from the audience. So literary text is going to concern itself with all of these things. But again, this is distinct from rhetorical analysis. So the literary text is more interested in how style, diction, figurative language, character setting, etc., animate or promote a certain implicit message within the text. So we can think of the text itself, the literary text, as a puzzle composed of many different parts. And the goal of the analyst is to take the puzzle apart and figure out what the hidden message is. It's almost like a cipher. It is a puzzle that needs to be deciphered and disassembled in order to unveil its secret meaning. So we'll think of a literary text as a puzzle designed to be disassembled or broken down. And this reveals the hidden meaning In the case of a story, we usually think of this as theme or lesson. And another word that we use for this is subtext. So not to load up too many different vocabulary words in this video, but essentially the goal of analysis is to break down a literary text, which again, we have established to be things like novels and short stories. We can think of these texts as puzzles, which are made up of different parts and constructed in particular ways. And by disassembling these different puzzles, we can arrive at their particular forms of meaning, their hidden messages, the embedded communications that the author has included, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And by doing that, we can learn more about the author. We can learn about his or her worldview and philosophy. And we can learn, therefore, about the context that gave birth to the author and the way he or she looks at the world. So with that being said, I hope that this video provided some clarity as to what a text is in the case and context of literary analysis. In the next video, we'll be looking at subtext in more detail and really trying to identify and narrow down what it is we're trying to uncover when we analyze a literary text.